December 1944. Europe had become a graveyard of iron and bone. The world was colder than anyone alive could remember. In the frozen heart of the Ardennes, the sun itself seemed to have surrendered to the smoke of artillery and the gray fog of war. By this stage of World War II, the lines between human beings had been erased. People were no longer individuals. They were simply allies or enemies. Among the thousands of prisoners held by the U.S. 7th Army were women, thousands of them. These were the Wehrmachtschaffen nurses, radio operators, and young girls who had been swept up in the final desperate recruitment of a collapsing Nazi Germany. To the American soldiers guarding them, they were the faces of the regime they had traveled 3,000 miles to destroy. To the women, the Americans were the monsters they had been warned about in every propaganda film. In the female POW camps, the atmosphere was thick with a single emotion: terror. These women had been fed a steady diet of hate. They were told that if the Americans ever captured them, they would face unspeakable cruelty. They expected no mercy. They expected no pity. They stood behind barbed wire with hollow eyes, shivering in their thin, tattered uniforms, waiting for the inevitable. But the morning of December 25th was different. The clock struck 5 a.m. The air was so freezing it felt like needles against the skin. The heavy wooden doors of the barracks creaked open, and the women filed out into the slushy mud. Their hands were swollen with frostbite. Their feet were numb. They lined up for the morning roll call, bracing themselves for the usual barked orders, the shovels and the 14-hour shift of manual labor, digging trenches and clearing the wreckage of war in the biting wind. A tall American sergeant stood before them. His face was weathered, his eyes weary from months of seeing his brothers in arms fall in battle. He had every reason to be bitter. He had every reason to treat these prisoners with the same coldness the war had shown him. He looked down at his clipboard, then up at the shivering line of exhausted women. He saw their fear. He saw their humanity. He cleared his throat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he looked at the translator and spoke 5 words that would shatter the frozen hearts of everyone present. Tell them ... no work today. It's Christmas. A deafening silence followed. The translator hesitated, then repeated the words in German. The women didn't move. They stared at the sergeant in total disbelief. They were waiting for the catch. They expected this to be a cruel joke, a psychological game before they were marched into the cold. But as the sergeant turned to walk away, the reality sank in. An elderly German nurse who had seen the horrors of the Eastern Front without shedding a single tear was the first to break. A sob escaped her throat, a sound of pure, raw release. Then a young girl, barely 18, fell to her knees in the snow, weeping into her frozen hands. Within minutes, the entire formation had collapsed into a collective breakdown of emotion. They weren't crying because they were happy to have a day off. They were crying because, for the first time in years, someone had acknowledged they were human. The American monster had just given them the greatest gift possible: dignity. This is the essence of the American story that the world often forgets. These G's were citizen soldiers. They were plumbers from Brooklyn, farmers from Kansas, and teachers from Ohio. They carried the values of their homes in their pockets. Even in the middle of the most brutal conflict in history, they could not completely extinguish the light of their own upbringing. The sergeant and his men didn't stop at just canceling the work detail. They went to their own meager supplies. They brought out white bread, real coffee, and bars of Hershey's chocolate luxuries that these women hadn't seen since the war began. In a gesture that defied every military manual ever written, the guards and the prisoners shared a moment of peace. The American soldiers began to hum Silent Night. The German women, through their tears, joined in. Two different languages, two different sides of a wire, but one singular melody of hope. For that one day the war didn't exist. There were no Nazis, no Yanks, no prisoners, and no guards. There were only people shivering together in the dark, trying to remember what it felt like to be at peace. For the U.S. audience watching this today, this story is a reminder of why that generation is called greatest. Their victory wasn't just measured in territory gained or cities liberated. It was measured in the souls they refused to crush. They proved that you could defeat an enemy without losing your own heart. When those women were eventually released and returned to a broken Germany, they didn't take back stories of American cruelty. They took back the memory of a sergeant who looked at his enemy and saw a neighbor. They took back the memory of the tears that washed away years of propaganda. The tears shed on that Christmas morning were the first bricks in the foundation of a new Europe. They were proof that kindness is a more powerful weapon than any artillery shell. Even today, in a world that feels increasingly divided. This story stands as a testament to the American spirit, a spirit that chooses grace over grievance and humanity over hate. The war resumed on December 26th. The shovels came back out and the guards went back to their posts. But the world had changed. The barbed wire was still there, but the wall of hatred had been torn down. Because on one frozen morning in 1944, a group of American boys decided that being a human being was more important than being a soldier. And that is a miracle worth remembering. The tears that fell in that camp were not just tears of relief. They were tears of a worldview shattering. To understand why this moment was so dekandar, so explosive in its emotional impact, you have to understand the psychological cage these women were in. For years, the German people had been told that Americans were a soulless, materialistic mongrel race who would treat German women like dirt. They expected a whip. They received a hand. When the sergeant uttered those words, "No work today," he wasn't just giving them a break from labor. He was performing an act of psychological warfare that no bomb could ever achieve. He was proving that the Nazi leaders had lied. As the women stood there, sobbing in the snow, the American guards did something even more unexpected. They didn't stand back with cold, indifferent expressions. Many of these young American boys, some of them only 19 or 20 years old, looked visibly moved. They saw their own sisters, their own mothers, and their own sweethearts in the faces of these terrified prisoners. One soldier, a private from Kentucky, famously reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled letter from home. He couldn't speak German, but he showed the photo of his family to one of the weeping nurses. In that moment, the enemy disappeared. There were only two people in a frozen field, sharing the pain of being a world away from the people they loved. Then came the special rations. The U.S. Army, even in the middle of a supply crisis during the Battle of the Bulge, managed to do something extraordinary. The camp commander allowed the mess hall to release white flour and sugar items that were like gold in war-torn Europe. While the German women were sent back to their barracks to stay warm, the American G's spent their own Christmas morning hauling crates of supplies to the prisoner quarters. Imagine the scene inside those dark wooden barracks. The women were huddled together, still trembling from the shock of the morning. Suddenly the doors opened again, but this time, instead of guards with rifles, it was soldiers carrying steaming pots of real coffee and loaves of white bread. For many of these women, who had been living on sawdust-filled Kriegsbrat, war bread, and watery turnip soup for years, the smell of fresh American coffee was overwhelming. One survivor later recalled, "We didn't just eat the bread. We held it to our faces. We smelled it. It smelled like civilization. It smelled like a world that wasn't at war." This is where the true American spirit shines for a U.S. audience. These soldiers weren't ordered to share their rations. They weren't told to be kind. They did it because it was in their DNA. They were the sons of a democracy that taught them that once a person is captured, they are no longer a target. They are a responsibility. As the afternoon light faded into a deep, icy blue, something even more magical happened. One of the German women, a former opera singer from Berlin, began to sing. She started softly, her voice thin and wavering in the cold air. She sang Still Not, the original German version of Silent Night. The American guards, standing outside in the snow to keep watch, heard the melody. Slowly, one by one, they began to join in, singing the English lyrics. Two languages, two opposing ideologies, and two different sides of a barbed wire fence, but the harmony was perfect. The voices rose above the camp, floating over the pine trees and the frozen trenches. For those few minutes the guns were silent. The hate was gone. The greatest generation was living up to its name, not by killing, but by showing the strength of mercy. But why does this story matter so much to the American viewer today? It matters because it defines the American exceptionalism that we all want to believe in. It shows that even when the world goes mad, even when the enemy is a regime of pure evil, the individual American soldier remains a man of conscience. There is a legendary detail from this specific camp. A sergeant noticed a young German girl, hardly more than a child, looking at his boots. Her own shoes were falling apart, her toes purple with cold. Without saying a word, the sergeant went back to his quarters, grabbed an extra pair of wool socks and a pair of oversized boots he had scavenged, and handed them to her. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't report it to his superiors. He just did it. That girl, years later, would move to the United States. She would tell her grandchildren that the reason they were Americans today was because of a man who gave his Dutchman enemy a pair of socks on a cold Christmas morning. The decandar truth of this story is that the Americans won the war twice. They won it on the battlefield with tanks and planes, but they won it more importantly in the hearts of the people they defeated. By refusing to be the monsters the propaganda claimed they were, they made it impossible for the German people to ever want to fight them again. As the sun set on December 25, 1944, the German female POWs didn't feel like prisoners anymore. They felt like humans who had been given a second chance at life. They realized that the Amos weren't there to destroy them. They were there to save the world from the darkness that had consumed Germany. The tears that flowed that day were the beginning of a long healing process for a broken continent. And for the American soldiers, it was a reminder of what they were fighting for, a world where a man can look at his enemy and say, "No work today." It's Christmas. The sun rose on December 26, 1944, over a world that was still at war. The orders returned, the whistles blew. The no-work order had expired, and the German female prisoners were marched back into the frozen fields to continue their labor. On the surface, everything looked the same. The barbed wire was still sharp, the guards were still armed, and the hunger was still real. But inside that camp, something fundamental had shifted. The atmosphere of fear had been replaced by a quiet, unspoken bond of respect. The Dekandar truth of this story isn't just about one day of rest. It's about what happened when the war finally ended in May 1945, when the gates of the camps were thrown open and the German prisoners were told they were free to go back to their ruined cities. A strange phenomenon occurred. While prisoners in other sectors, those held by the Soviet Union, fled in terror or disappeared into the gulags, the women who had been held by the Americans carried something different in their hearts. They carried a story. They went back to Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt cities turned into mountains of ash, and they told their families about the American sergeant. They told them about the white bread, the chocolate, and the silent night sung in 2 languages. This act of Christmas mercy became a seed. It was the seed from which a new, democratic Germany would grow. Think about the American audience's perspective. Why did West Germany become America's strongest ally in the decades that followed? It wasn't just because of the Marshall Plan or the billions of dollars in aid. It was because of thousands of small, unrecorded moments like that Christmas morning in 1944. The American soldier had done the impossible. He had conquered the enemy's soul with kindness. He had made it impossible for these people to ever hate America again. One of the most powerful accounts comes from a woman named Maria, who was just 19 when she was a prisoner in that camp. Decades later, living as a great-grandmother in Ohio, yes. She eventually moved to the very country that had captured her. She sat down with a historian. With tears in her eyes, she reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a faded, yellowed piece of a Hershey's chocolate wrapper. She had kept it for over 50 years. "The Americans gave us back our lives that day," she said. "They showed us that we were still women, still humans, still worth a moment of peace. That wrapper was my first taste of freedom. It tasted like the America I wanted to belong to." This is the ultimate Dekandar moment for the viewer. It proves that the American GI was the greatest ambassador the United States ever had. While the Nazi regime built monuments to hate and power, the American soldier built a legacy through a simple act of no work today. As we look back at this history, we have to ask ourselves, what makes a nation truly great? Is it the size of its nuclear arsenal? Is it the strength of its economy? Or is it the character of its youngest men when they are 3,000 miles away from home, standing in the mud, holding the power of life and death over their enemies? For the U.S. audience, the answer is clear. The greatest generation didn't just win the war because they had more tanks. They won because they had more heart. They understood that the ultimate victory isn't killing your enemy. It's making your enemy realize that they were on the wrong side of humanity. The story of the female German post breaking down in tears is a story of moral superiority. It's a story that reminds every American watching today that their flag stands for something more than just territory. It stands for a code of honor that persists even in the darkest, coldest nights of human history. As the screen fades to black, imagine the sound of those women sobbing in the snow one last time. But don't hear it as a sound of defeat. Hear it as the sound of a world being reborn. Those tears washed away the brainwashing of a cult. They washed away the desperation of a lost cause. Today that camp is gone. The barbed wire has rusted away and the wooden barracks have rotted into the soil. The sergeant and the women he guarded are mostly gone now, taking their places in the silent rows of history. But the lesson remains. In a world that often feels like it's back in the Ardennes forest cold, divided and filled with enemies, we must remember that 5 words can still change everything. No work today. It's Christmas. Those words weren't a sign of weakness. They were the ultimate display of American strength, because the strongest man in the world isn't the one who pulls the trigger. It's the one who has every reason to hate, but chooses to show mercy instead. This Christmas and every Christmas hereafter, we should remember those tears. Not because they were shed by an enemy, but because they were dried by a hero in an American uniform. A hero who knew that even in the middle of a world war, there is always time to be a human being. This is the American legacy. This is why we remember. And this is why, despite all our flaws, the world still looks to that light in the window, the light of a nation that knows how to turn a prisoner into a friend through the simple, breathtaking power of grace.